The work in the project of the Messerschmitt Me 262 started in September 1939, just 1 month after the first flight of the Heinkel He-178, which consequently had become the first successful turbojet aircraft in the world. However, due to the delays in the development of satisfactory engines, to the massive damage caused to the German industry by Allied bombings, and to the later obsession of using this aircraft as a bomber instead of a fighter, almost 4 years passed between the first outlines of the Me 262 and its entry into service. In July 1943, a demonstration of the prototype was made in presence of the High Command of the Luftwaffe, being among these officers Hermann Göring, who talked with enthusiasm to Hitler about the new fighter aircraft. However, the Führer refused to give priority to the project and prohibited its serial production. This decision would delay the entire program for 6 months. In November 1943, Hitler saw for the first time the Me 262 in flight, when the sixth prototype, named Me 262 V6, performed a demonstrative flight to Insterburg, in eastern Prussia. During the demonstration, Hitler asked to Göring if the Me 262 could be adapted for carrying bombs. Göring, who some time ago had made the same question to Messerschmitt, replied that it was theoretically possible. Suddenly Hitler showed enthusiasm about the new aircraft, for it could become the lightning bomber that he had been waiting for. Shortly after, the Air Ministry ordered the production of the Me 262, and in the late 1943, the program of the new turbojet fighter was given top priority. In December 1943 flew for the first time the Me 262 V8, the first prototype which carried the full armament of 4 Mk 108 30mm cannons. Regardless of the numerous inconveniences, the production of the Me 262 began to get a good pace in April 1944. The factories which produced the structure and the assembling plants were scattered on several distant locations to better protect them against the Allied bombings. The original objective was to achieve a monthly production of 1,000 aircraft in May 1945, but it was soon seen that this number would never be reached. Actually, the largest number of monthly production ever reached was 280. This happened in March 1945 and was a notable production, having into account that the German aeronautical industry had been forced to abandon many of its factories due to the fast advance of the Allied forces. At the end of 1944, the production reached 730 exemplars, and during the first months of 1945 another 564 were completed. Despite the obsession of turning the Me 262 into a lightning bomber, this aircraft entered production as a pure fighter aircraft. The first series exemplars entered service in August 1944 in an experimental unit called Erprobungskommando 262, EK-262, which was based in Lechfeld, near Augsburg. The unit was initially under the command of Captain Thierfelder, who died when his aircraft crashed and set ablaze during one of the first operational missions of the unit. His successor was Commander Walter Nauetny, who being only 23 years old was already one of the best fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe, having achieved 258 victories, of which 255 took place in the Eastern Front. In the late October 1944, the Erprobungskommando 262, which by then had been renamed as Kommando Nauetny, had reached full operative status, and consequently it was sent to the airfields at Akmar and Hiesepe, near Osnabrück, in the route of approximation used by the USAF for its diurnal bombings over German cities. Due to technical problems and to the scarcity of adequately trained pilots, the Kommando Nauetny could effectuate only 3 or 4 daily raids against the Allied bomber formations. Still so, in November 1944, their Me 262 shot down 22 aircraft. However, at the end of the month, the unit had only 13 operational aircraft from a total of 30. This high percentage of attrition was due to accidents more than to enemy activity. The Me 262 had a rich and complex electronic equipment for contemporary standards, which included, among other elements, a radio emitter/receiver and devices for radio navigation and blind flying. The aircraft modified for night fighting had as well radio localization devices and automatic radio direction finders of great precision. In this case, the radio localization devices left space for only 2 cannons, and the antennas installed in the nose of the aircraft reduced their top speed in at least 60 km/h, but the Me-262 was nonetheless a superb night fighter. The electronic equipment required a dedicated operator who sat behind the pilot beneath an enlarged canopy. During the last weeks of 1944, the Me-262 was the prime threat for the Allied air superiority. In that time, 2 versions were being developed parallelly: the fighter variant Me-262A1, a Schwalbe, Swallow, and the fighter-bomber variant Me-262A2, a Sturmbogel, Stormbird. In September 1944, the Sturmbogel was assigned to the Kampfgeschwader 51 Edelweiss, as well as other bomber squadrons such as the KG-6, KG-27, and KG-54. The entering into combat was delayed by some problems which emerged during the operational training, but in the autumn of 1944 the Sturmbogel began to appear in increasing numbers, performing low-altitude attacks against enemy targets, mainly moving columns. There were also 2 reconnaissance versions, the Me-262A1A/U3 and the Me-262A5A. These aircraft flew almost undisturbed for weeks over the battlefront, photographing facilities and movements of troops in the enemy rearguard. This gave the German High Command a full intelligence report of the Allied order of battle in northern France, Netherlands, and Belgium. Sliding at low altitude above the front line whilst following the contour of the terrain, the Me-262 used to achieve a full surprise, ending their missions before the enemy defenses could react. The high speed granted by their 2 turbojet engines made difficult for the anti-aircraft artillery to track them, and piston engine fighters could hope to reach them only if performing a fast dive from high altitude. In an attempt to neutralize the threat posed by the Me-262, the Allies organized patrols with Hawker Tempest fighter aircraft flying in pairs over the front line, with a second pair waiting in the ground ready for taking off, with the hope of chasing any incoming Me-262. However, the very well camouflaged Me-262 usually managed to avoid these patrols. The Allied fighter aircraft also attempted to attack the bases of the Me-262, but this was a very dangerous approach, for the German had organized anti-aircraft corridors of 3 kilometers in length, where quadruple batteries of 20mm cannons had been deployed, right before the accesses to the runways of their airfields. Besides, a group of FW-190 fighter aircraft from the Jagdgeschwader 54 had been assigned to the defense of the 2 main bases at Akmar and Hizipy. At the end of 1944, the Soviet enjoyed an overwhelming air superiority in the Eastern Front, because the largest part of the German fighter aircraft had been withdrawn from there to be destined to the defense of the Reich. The Me-262 were frequently seen, but the attacks upon their bases were costing them an increasing price. The November 8, 1944 Walter Nowotny was shot down and killed by a Mustang P-51 fighter aircraft when he was landing in Akmar. Shortly after his death, remnants of the Commando Nowotny were used to form the core of a new turbojet fighter unit, the 3 Gruppe of the Jagdgeschwader 7. Albeit the JG-7 comprised 3 groups, only the 3/JG-7 ever had contact with the enemy. The 3 groups of the Jagdgeschwader 7, the first of which had been created in August 1944, were based at Brandenburg-Brest, Oranienburg and Parchim. The badge of this prestigious fighter squadron, which is often associated to the Me-262, consists of a blue or transparent shield crossed diagonally by a strip of dark color on which a white running fox is encased. In the mid-February 1945, the 3/JG-7 received its first delivery of our 4M Orkan 55mm air-to-air rockets. The Me-262 could carry 24 R-4M rockets on wooden pylons under the wings, or 2 BR-21 210mm rockets on tubes under the fuselage. When a salvo was fired against a formation of enemy bombers, the rockets scattered similarly as shotgun pellets do, increasing so the chances of hitting one or more aircraft. Later in that same month, and by using our 4M rockets along with the 30mm cannons, the pilots from the 3/JG-7 managed to destroy 45 four-engine bombers of the Yuzov and 15 of their escorting fighter aircraft, whilst losing only 4 of their Me-262. In the meantime, the creation of a second turbojet fighter squadron had been authorized. This unit, known as the Jagdverband 44, was integrated by 45 very expert pilots, many of whom were aces with the highest number of victories, commanded by Lieutenant General Adolf Galland. Their main base of operations was Munich Rhein, where the bombers from the Air Force of the 15th Army were their main targets, whereas the JG-7 continued operating in central and northern Germany. The April 7, 1945, the JG-7 made a demonstration of the potential of the Me-262 by destroying 28 American escort fighters of the types P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang. But in return, it was impossible to ignore the fact that in that same day, during the last series of important aerial combats over Germany, the Luftwaffe had lost 183 fighter aircraft of the types Me, Bf-109 and Fw-190. 3 days later, about 1,000 of American bombers effectuated massive bombings over the airbases from where the turbojet fighters operated. The Me-262 shot down 10 bombers, but, with their bases devastated, they were forced to withdraw to places as far away as Prague, and their units were disorganized. In the last days of April, what remained of the JV-44 moved further to the south, to Salzburg, where the aircraft had to stay in the ground due to the lack of fuel. The largest part of these aircraft were destroyed by their crews shortly before the May 3rd, when the airbase was seized by American forces. From a total of almost 1,500 aircraft Me-262 produced during the war, less than the fourth part entered combat. If the number had been much larger, they would have inflicted a severe punishment to the American diurnal bombers, and also to the British nocturnal bombers, for the potential of the Me-262 as a night fighter was seen too late. The main fault of the Me-262 was not on its design, but in the wrong employment which was made of it. Hitler, and perhaps Messerschmitt himself, motivated by self-interest and the pursuit of prestige, insisted in using an aircraft which had been born as a pure fighter as a ground strike aircraft. This mistake caused the loss of a considerable number of aircraft which were forced to decrease their speed for dropping their bombs, becoming so vulnerable to the enemy fighter aircraft, and a waste of fuel and materials on which Germany should not have indulged.